You're listening to Heritage Radio Network.
Have you ever looked at the fish on your plate and wondered, I wonder where this came from? And what had to happen for it to get there? It's a question that reveals far more than just the origin of your dinner. It opens up a conversation about sustainability, responsibility, and our connection to the natural world. You're listening to One Bite is Everything, connecting the food on your plate to the rest of the world. I am DiPrima, and I'm your host. As a consumer, a home cook, and a restaurant goer, I find seafood to be the most confusing. Which is better, line-caught or farmed? When is farmed seafood good and when is it not? And how do you know which fish at any given time are being overfished and should be given a serious pause? Today on the show, we're diving into these questions and more, including how can chefs become powerful advocates for our oceans, and why should they? To help us explore that, we are joined by Chef Kerry Heffernan, executive chef at Grand Banks. Chef Kerry is known not just for his culinary expertise, and boy, has he been at the center of some of the best restaurants, not to mention the creation of Shake Shack burgers, but he's recognized for his leadership in sustainable seafood and in influencing fishery policies. And before we take a deep dive, I want you to imagine Chef Kerry's office. It is a 142-foot wooden schooner moored in the waters of the mighty Hudson River on the west side of Manhattan. The schooner, the Sherman Zwicker, is the largest wooden vessel in New York City. We spoke from the hold of that ship, a very appropriate nautical setting for this conversation indeed. In this episode, you'll hear 1. How Kerry's life by the water shaped his approach to food. 2. Why a lesser-known fish like the porgy deserves a ceviche spotlight. And 3. How chefs can influence both dining culture and environmental policy. We'll also touch on a surprising truth about fish freshness that might just change the way you buy and eat your seafood. If you are ready to rethink the impact of what you eat and how to make more meaningful choices, then stay with us. This is One Bite is Everything.
Growing up in Connecticut, I didn't realize how much access it was to the waterfront. There were lobster fishermen and barely beknownst to me, there were oyster farmers right off where I grew up.
Where is that?
Norwalk, Rowayton, Connecticut. It's about an hour out of the city in Fairfield County. So yeah, I was a young, teen getting in trouble and not doing so well in school. And the long story short is that I ended up going to vocational school where I chose cooking and was able to graduate a year early because it was pretty easy, the academic requirements, and got accepted to the Culinary Institute, and then took a year that I would have normally been in high school to travel to France on my bike by myself. Came back, went to culinary school, back to New York, worked in, in those days, there was this renaissance around the hotels. So I was working at some of the Palace Hotel, the Waldorf Astoria had this incredible renaissance going on. Then I went back to Europe to work for a year in Switzerland, came back to the States, worked with David Bouley and met Tom Colicchio and worked with him.
David Bouley and Tom Colicchio are two culinary giants who have shaped the food world in their own distinct ways. Bouley, with his refined French techniques and passion for seasonal ingredients, became a trailblazer in New York's fine dining scene, drawing food lovers to his renowned restaurant for a taste of artful French cuisine with a modern edge. His focus on health-conscious cooking and culinary education has left a lasting legacy beyond the kitchen. On the other hand, Tom Colicchio has built an empire rooted in simplicity and quality with his flagship restaurant Craft and his role as a tough but fair judge on Top Chef, cementing his place as a household name. Known for his no-nonsense critiques and his unwavering commitment to fresh, ingredient-driven dishes, Colicchio has also become a champion for sustainable food practices and food justice.
Some back and forth to Europe again for more stages and interesting sort of exposures to mostly French cuisine and their system. The short route of they don't call it farm to table because everyone who's not in the city lives near a farm. It's not like it's a big deal. The marchés are like part of their lives, right? And then worked again with David Boulay, opened Boulay to that crazy, success, and ended up working with Tom Colicchio when he first opened Mondrian. Had some more experiences running restaurants and hotels. Ended up opening 11 Madison Park and running that for 7 years. While I was there, Danny came to me this idea about something from his childhood that he wanted to recreate in Madison Square Park. So I developed a Shake Shack menu and burger. It was right around then that I started getting interested in sustainability because Danny was very close to suppliers. He wanted to make sure we had the most ethical relationships and that they had the best in sourcing. So it was something that, beyond immediate was also about, how are they doing it? So I got much more involved with fishing and sustainable seafood. This is going back now 25 years, maybe more. Would fish a lot with Tom Colicchio, who I still fish with very often. Through all that, we ended up getting a house in Sag Harbor, and I hang oyster cages off my dock. So I have a real idea of what it takes and what goes on, throughout the whole year with a very meager amateur stewardship of aquaculture. So it gives me a little bit more insight when I talk to oyster farmers and what they go through and their methods and what they're up against.
I'm just curious, like way back up in Connecticut when you were a kid, were you fishing with your family?
A little bit. Fishing wasn't something we did a lot. We were more sailing focused and swim team and that kind of stuff.
You were kind of close to the water and then you got into
We
fishing
lived
more.
on the water. We were on the 5 Mile River. Our house was across the street from boatyards.
And through all of this long resume of incredible storied restaurants, and now here you are on a boat and you have this whole fishing experience and you've got your oysters off your dock. Does that make total sense to you that it kind of came back to the water?
Absolutely. I mean, it was just a coincidence, stroke of luck. Friend of a friend knew someone who was looking for someone here, and that's really how I ended up here.
Do you like it there?
Love it here. I mean, 10 years, you saw my office. It isn't always perfect, but it's certainly lovely, challenging, hard to describe to someone who hasn't been here, the experience of being on the Hudson with these views and access to all this sort of wonderful, sustainable seafood. A point of serving it. I mean, since then, I've become involved with Monterey Bay Aquarium on their Blue Ribbon Council of Chefs on their Seafood Watch arm. I've done a lot of work in policy and legislation. That's a bit of a dead end right now, unfortunately. It doesn't mean that the work stops. It just means that you don't really have high hopes of a positive outcome for the moment.
I want to come back to some of that work in a minute. I'm curious about in the dot to dot of your experience, from culinary school to where you are now. There were some major influences there. You mentioned Danny Meyer and sustainability. Can you give me a couple of examples of what happened during those kind of formative years as you were chefing about?
Sure. Like I said, we trained in Europe, so we saw how closely knit the land and the ocean, but more the land and the restaurants were, especially if you work in restaurants in the countryside, which I did a couple of times. We was in this restaurant in Belgium where they had this elaborate potato and caviar dish on the menu. This is 25, 30 years ago before it was really a big deal here. And most people would eat the tasting menu. So they had this dish on the menu, but no one ever ordered it. Well, one day someone ordered it and they didn't have the potatoes. So one of the commis was a farm kid from the neighboring farm, and they sent him out with a flashlight to dig the potatoes for this dish. And that was eye-opening. Yeah. Beyond that, one of our stakeholders were our guests, our staff, and our suppliers, not necessarily in that order. And to really get a sense of what your suppliers went through We do farm visits, and we would spend a lot of time at the Union Square Green Market and see what was in season and learn more about, the hardships and what an April frost might do to the stone fruits, for example, what a particularly hot summer might do to some of the leafy greens, it's all that sort of stuff, how long it might take for tomatoes to come in. So we were very in touch. Again, this is like 1997, we're talking about before this was all a thing.
So you're visiting the farms there and you're just really getting to understand what their business flow looks like.
Yes. And then I started fishing and seeing these sort of the increase in abundance in a certain species when a number of factors came together, and then the rapid decrease of that same species. I'm talking about striped bass. When I see another, a much more powerful set of conditions come into play.
Striped bass is a popular fish native to the Atlantic coast of North America. Known for its distinct horizontal black stripes and strong athletic build, it is a prized catch for anglers and a staple in coastal cuisine. Striped bass thrive in both saltwater and freshwater, migrating between the two during their life cycle, which makes them an interesting subject for conservation efforts. Their populations have faced significant challenges due to overfishing, habitat loss, and water pollution. Efforts to protect striped bass have led to regulations on fishing seasons, size limits, and quotas in many regions. Interestingly, striped bass are also farmed in aquaculture, although farming practices have raised concerns over environmental sustainability. The species remains an important part of the ecosystem, as they are apex predators in their environments, helping regulate populations of smaller fish and maintaining balance in aquatic systems.
Striped bass were once abundant and then nearly extinct is the wrong word, but very, very, there was a moratorium on striped bass in the 70s because there were so few of them. They put some rather strong measures, the conservation measures in place, and the fishery came back. And then we had a number of years where recruitment, which is sort of how many fish from eggs turn into fry that turn into young of the year, was very strong. So the fishery rebounded. Now, young of the year to sexually mature or catchable fish, shall we say, of 10 pounds can be 10 to 12 years. So the game is a long one for most Americans. The last 6 years have been absolutely miserable, like frightening for recruitment, which means there are these year classes out there right now that are huge. I mean, the number of fish is large, but the size of the fish is big because they came from this very robust class of fish in the early 2000s. So people think fishing is good, striped bass are healthy, etc. The truth is, behind that, there's very little. And so, you can't look at one year class or a couple of year classes and some Instagram posts to sort of get a sense of the whole picture. There have been positive moves, but that could all be for naught coming very quickly with what the EPA threatens to do. We were lucky we had a cool winter, so this year we may have an actual decent year class, but the truth around climate change, ocean temperature change, ocean acidification is all very, very bad for those sorts of species in their traditional haunts, which is the Chesapeake.
The Chesapeake Bay, once a vibrant and diverse ecosystem, is facing an unprecedented crisis due to climate change, rising ocean temperatures, and ocean acidification. Water temperatures in the bay have increased by about 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit over the last few decades, impacting species like blue crabs, oysters, and all kinds of fish. Ocean acidification, driven by increased CO2 absorption, is affecting shell-forming creatures like oysters, but scientists are actively researching solutions to help protect these vital species. While the oyster population has declined by over 90% since the 1800s, conservation efforts are showing promise in restoring their numbers and improving water quality. These changes are not just ecological, they're economic too. The Chesapeake Bay seafood industry, worth over $5 billion annually, is at risk, with marine life that depends on stable, healthy waters increasingly in danger. As the bay's ecosystem falters, the species that call it home and the livelihoods that depend on it are facing great challenges. However, with ongoing research and environmental stewardship, there is still potential for this iconic ecosystem to thrive and adapt to the changing climate. So help me understand how you got deeper into this. You're a chef and now you're deep into the policy, you're deep into the classes of fish, what the availability is. How did that happen? And tell me how you're understanding this information.
Well, a lot through fishing and then through understanding, sort of spending time with the scientists and the people who deal with the policy and spending time with lawmakers to see what it takes to actually make any change. And again, there were some successes a while ago, and we did see some change, but the future is not bright, shall we say. The worst part of this is the way that they allocate the fish is based on states, and each state gets to sort of allocate them differently. So New York has a recreational fishery and a commercial fishery. But for example, Maryland and Delaware, they only get those fish in the winter and the early spring when they're spawning. So they're allowed to catch them and kill them and sell them. So if you see striped bass in the market anywhere from February through probably early April, they're 95% chance they're from one of those two states and they're pregnant. So what they're doing is they're killing their future, our future, the collective future, because that's their only chance at getting those fish. And everyone has a little piece of that fishery. So that's when they can take it. It's politics, like I said, that it's managed by something called the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Council. And they come up with these quotas to give a certain allotment of fish to each of the states that are members. And the only way that Virginia and Maryland is to get them when they're spawning, which is in February, March, and April. And they kill and sell the pregnant ones.
Well, there have to be some other fish-related issues. What else can you tell me about the fish business?
There's an awful lot, unfortunately. There's good news in aquaculture to some extent. There's also some very bad news in aquaculture. I'm sure you're aware of net pen salmon farm fishing in Maine, Canada, less so in Norway, Chile, and in those places where it's just bad news. There's also some very good, responsible farming going on in those respects. I mean, the one most positive thing is probably shellfish aquaculture, and mostly oyster, because every single oyster they put in the water is going to be filtering, you could say between 8 and 10 gallons a day of water. Now, they're filtering for microorganisms and plankton and algae. So what they're doing is they're keeping a balance in the water. They're not taking pollutants out per se, because then they wouldn't be any good to eat. But what happens is as the water warms and these algae and microorganisms have a chance to multiply in greater numbers than is their typical balance, you get red tides, you get fish kills, you get toxins that are the byproduct of these tides, compounded by increase in surface temperature. And, in my little cove in Sag Harbor, the water is sometimes 84 degrees. That's surface temperature, but still, it's a little alarming.
I'm curious about what consumers hear about mercury levels in fish and fish lists of what you should be eating and shouldn't. So you have a fish list where, striped bass has these class issues and maybe some loopholes.
Yeah, I haven't intentionally killed a striped bass in about, 8 years, probably 7 years.
So you catch and release.
Catch and release, yeah. And that's getting harder and harder. And that's kind of the story of how we got porgy on the menu, because we wanted to have something local and sustainable for a crudo or ceviche. And I kind of thought about fluke and striped bass, but fluke numbers aren't great. And when I would go out and try and catch striped bass, a lot of times I'd end up, going porgy fishing because it was just much more rewarding. And I had kids in the boat and that kind of thing. So I discovered that porgy is a lesser known, lesser loved fish, not one that typically falls into the level of fine dining because it's a little bony, a little small. The flesh, when it's cooked, is fine, but it's not as delicate as something like black sea bass. So we ended up serving it raw, where it absolutely outshines all those. It's better than striped bass, It's different than black sea bass is still wonderful, but it's more firm and less interesting. Porgy's got this suppleness, this toothsome sort of wonderful accessibility to sort of melt in your mouth and meld with the flavors in a way that, I find fluke boring. It's just kind of there. It isn't very interesting at all to me.
Let me ask you about this, because it's a very interesting place that you sit, where you have an opportunity to say, you've never heard of this, or it's been considered a lesser fish, but I'm a chef and I know exactly, how this works against other fish. So you have this opportunity to really educate consumers. It's sort of exciting.
Very. And it is the one place where we find easy engagement. We are very fortunate in that people, as you know, when you come here, it's generally a very happy time. You get the sun, you're on the boat, you're having some kind of a cocktail. There's a lot of really positive energy going on. So when you say, here's what we've chosen for our crudo, people are like, great. And they're willing to go right along. It's not like, oh, gee, I would rather have X, Y, or Z. It's much more about, wow, that's wonderful. Thank you. That's delicious.
And are you having those kinds of conversations about sustainability there on your boat?
With the staff? Of course. Oh, yeah. All the time with the staff. On the porgy, on everything that we serve pretty much. Obviously, the oysters, that's an easy one. We had another dish on the menu using steelhead, which was from an RAS farm in Hudson Valley. It's RAS, recirculated aquaculture system, so it is absolutely the most sustainable way to raise any fish, because it's a labor-intensive technical process that involves a high degree of filtration of the water. And why that's important is because typical land-based aquaculture would suck a lot of water out of the aquifer and then dump a lot of dirty water back into the nearest water system. Here, they filter it, and so the water loss is minimal. What that means is it's basically this incredibly sterile and delicate environment. So they don't have to use antibiotics. They don't have to use a lot of, hormones and things like that. So they can achieve these, wonderful, steelhead, for lack of a better explanation, is pretty much a salmon at this point. When you talk about what you can do to modify the flesh with genetics and diet, which is what all these fisheries do. They're not taking wild fish and trying to, catch their spawn and create that. That is not happening in these environments.
And where do you sit then in terms of like a menu between wild caught and farmed?
I sit wherever the best and most sustainable of each of those falls. So if you're catching something in an unsustainable way and it's wild, that's not really a big bonus. If you're farming something in an unsustainable way, that's not a good idea either. But neither one nor the other is better. They're just different, and there are different approaches to both. To be honest, the trend is have to go massively towards aquaculture, because what we're doing to the oceans with the increase in population and the decrease of so much of that whole ecosystem. So it's not just about decreasing, catching all the fish. It's about catching all the bait. It's about changing the level of the chemistry of the water so that the microorganisms that the bait feed on aren't there to the same extent.
And tell me a little bit about your activism in that regard. I know you mentioned some EPA policies and challenges now with legislation, but what are the goals there for you?
Well, the goals are to involve as many people as possible to make sure that their voices are heard in Washington or locally. Again, it's a very challenging moment right now, but if enough people say this is important to us.
The current political challenges facing U.S. fisheries have intensified under the administration's deregulation agenda, which has significantly disrupted fishery management and conservation efforts. A key issue is the regulatory freeze implemented in January 2025, halting critical rulemaking processes, which left the fishing industry in limbo. This freeze not only delayed vital regulations, but also caused confusion within the industry, especially among stakeholders relying on timely policy changes. Additionally, the Trump administration's funding cuts to environmental initiatives have slowed the transition to more sustainable fishing practices, despite calls for more eco-friendly solutions. Recent federal court ruling also declared the structure of the Mid-Atlantic Fishery Management Council unconstitutional, leaving management processes in disarray. With these actions, the fishing industry is caught in a perfect storm of regulatory uncertainty, workforce depletion, and environmental setbacks, threatening both sustainability and the long-term viability of U.S. fisheries.
And I think people forget, oh, it's just fish, or oh, it's just the water, it'll be there, we can suck it out. Well, two things. One is we're looking at a much longer game where this is not our fish, this is our children's fish. And you look at places like Long Island or any coastal part of the United States where, to be frank, waterside real estate is a premium. And if those waters are polluted and full of rotting dead fish, that premium will go down very quickly. And that would be significant in a place like Suffolk County, where you have all those houses contributing to a tax base. That would change.
Do you think that's motivating enough for people to make significant changes in how they approach seafood?
Probably not. I wish I could say. Maybe they're kids.
I'm always sitting in this place where I'm trying to give people opportunities to make small changes because I don't think anybody is reading a blog, listening to a podcast, going on social media, looking for a big change in their life. But if they can change their attitude just a little bit or do something even small, or maybe the change comes later, but the awareness comes now. I always think that's so positive and important.
I agree. And you're right. Small changes can lead to a little bit more awareness, a little bit more engagement, sort of buying into the bigger picture slowly.
And if things were different, politically speaking, do you have top priorities that you'd be focused on in terms of our water, our ocean, our, population of ocean life?
Well, it's kind of simple in a way. It's that basically there's something called the Magnuson-Stevens Fishing Act.
The Magnuson-Stevens Fishery Conservation and Management Act, or MSA, enacted in 1976, serves as the primary framework for managing marine fisheries in U.S. federal waters. It established regional fishery management councils responsible for developing fishery management plans tailored to the specific needs of different regions. The act aims to prevent overfishing and promote the sustainability of marine ecosystems by implementing measures such as catch limits and rebuilding plans for overfished stocks. Since its passage, the MSA has been credited with reducing overfishing in the United States federal waters by more than 70%. It has contributed to the recovery of numerous fish species, including the Pacific bluefin tuna, which was successfully rebuilt after being classified as overfished. The act has faced criticism regarding the economic impact on fishing communities, particularly in terms of the strict regulations and catch limits that can affect livelihoods. Additionally, some stakeholders have expressed concerns over the pace at which rebuilding efforts are carried out.
I'm sure you're aware of it. It is standing, but if it's allowed to do its job and be enforced to the letter of the law, that would pretty much take care of a lot of these problems because it was actually very smartly conceived. It's been around for quite some time, I think, even the late 70s. And it basically says that if, there's federal and state managed fisheries. And it says that if either one is, especially the federal, if the practices in place are exceeding, what they call overfishing or being overfished, then the regulations have to change. Sounds pretty simple, right? It's the way that they define overfishing, overfished, and it gets very wonky after that. But it is a very simple mandate that would probably cover most things. Now, it gets much more specific after that. For example, we are trying to get local New York kelp, but it's a very long federal approval process. So, that is taking some time. It's being harvested sustainably by the Shinnecock Indian Nation, as a matter of fact, in the east end of Long Island. and other people who are growing it, commercially or harvesting it. Kelp would be a great answer because what it does is it grows in the winter. It grows very fast. So it doesn't really interfere with other people's lives and fisheries. And it's one of the few things that metabolizes nitrogen out of the water. We have way too much nitrogen in our local waters. That's a big problem. You could ask any of your local oyster farmers, and they would tell you that that's a big. So again, nitrogen is one of those sort of fuels for those algae blooms. So you have too much nitrogen, high water temperature, not enough shellfish filtering the algae, and you get these super blooms of algae that are deadly. These red and brown and rust tides.
And the kelp helps mitigate that.
Kelp uses nitrogen as food, just like other land-based plants. And it's a fascinating plant. It's older than life on land. We use kelp in our recipes. We use kelp when we cook the lobster and also in the lobster roll.
In terms of sort of local sources that you use for the restaurant, who would you pair yourself with in terms of, those resources?
That's a great question. I'd pair myself with myself because I could go out and catch the fish.
Can you serve fish that you catch in your restaurant?
No, I can't. Not legally, because there's a lot of legal issues, like in terms of when you catch a fish, it has to be going through a facility that has the ability, not the requirement, but the ability to be federally inspected. About 5% of all, wild fish or even farm fish is federally inspected. It has to go from the fisherman to somebody else who can then be the wholesaler who can land it. And then from that person to a wholesale person who delivers it to us. So it typically 4 hands would be sort of the minimum before it gets to your plate.
How long does that take in terms of my fish's freshness?
It can be within hours.
Oh, okay.
It could be days. But I've also come to the feeling that a lot of fish is better served 2 or 3 days after it's caught.
Why is that?
Because you don't know, unless you catch it yourself, if it's been treated properly to deal with the rigor mortis. And that can lend to stiffness and a rubbery unpleasantness in fish that's just landed. It also develops more flavor. And like anything else, if you dry age it a little bit, you are extracting some moisture. So you're concentrating. All sushi is definitely a couple of days old. I remember I caught a fish and I gave it to Morimoto and I was so proud. And I caught it the day before and he goes, I'm going to let this one sit for 3 days. And I'm like, what? It's very much a trend. It has to be practiced carefully, but you can do it at home. If you get a whole fish and, it's gutted and cleaned and rinsed, to make sure there's no slime or especially in its stomach cavity. And then you just put it on like a rack or something where there's airflow and it's in the bottom part of your fridge where it's coldest. So, 35, 38 degrees and with the ability for air to get around it. I would definitely suggest that. Again, you have to know that the fish is relatively fresh. If you get the fish from a fish market and you can't tell, you may not be able to do that. That's with a pristine specimen.
I'm still going back to some of your early experience. You weren't so focused on fish necessarily.
No, there was just restaurants serving the best of what's available. That's for sure. Even at Boulette in the late 80s, we were going to the green market. We were making relationships with, those early purveyors and stuff. And we were serving black sea bass, which is still probably the most delicate and finest fish that swims in our local seas and is in decent shape. But the interesting thing about black sea bass is that the strength of the current fishery in New York and Massachusetts is actually genetically Virginia-based.
Really?
Those fish have moved however many miles that is based solely on bait and temperature. And in 10, 15 years, they probably won't be here.
They go where their environment goes.
That's right. Exactly. They don't need to respect state borders or any of that.
I think people understand or think they understand maybe beef and chicken a lot better than they understand fish. It feels like more
100%.
mysterious.
It's easier. You can see them. The process has been documented in so many ways and times. People see sides of beef. They see animals walking in the pasture. It's sort of equatable.
Fish is maybe more mysterious in a way. It's very
Totally.
wild, right?
Happens, in a place that 99% of us can never see. Even the fishermen don't see the fish before they catch them for the most part. They're using, sonar and known spots to find them.
Tell me about your fishing and your experience out on the water.
I've been saltwater fishing for probably 30 years, a lot with Tom Colicchio, but that's pretty much an anytime I can sort of thing. Like this weekend, there's a good chance there's small striped bass in my little cove in I call my backyard in Sag Harbor. They're there for, a few weeks in the spring. And then you kind of expand the net, and then there's like the Peconics. So that's like basically west of Sag Harbor and East Hampton and Shelter Island. That's what I call the Peconics. And then as the water warms up, the fish move further east into Plum Island and, Montauk. And then as it gets further, they might go sort of Block Island. There's a whole bunch of oceanic fish that follow. They're talking striped bass now, a different pattern. And then you have bluefish, you have the porgies that really don't go as far, the fluke, the black sea bass and all that. And then you have the pelagics, which are the tuna. And when the tuna are in targetable numbers, all bets are off because that's all I want to do. So I chase tuna on my boat, and hopefully I don't hook one that's too big because I wouldn't have a chance at landing it. I don't have the gear or the tackle to physically hoist it up. I don't have the permits to kill it.
And how often are you out there?
Much as I can.
That was Chef Kerry Heffernan, chef, fisherman, and advocate, reminding us that sustainability doesn't start in the kitchen. It starts in the water, on the docks, and in the choices that we make long before our food gets to the plate. In this conversation, we traced Kerry's path from coastal Connecticut to the helm of Grand Banks, heard how porgy went from overlooked to unforgettable, and learned why a few days' age can make a fish taste better, not worse. More importantly, we explored how chefs can push food culture forward by being educators, activists, and connectors. As you go about your week, consider this. What seafood are you choosing? Where does it come from? And who is affected by how it's caught or farmed? Awareness is the first step toward change. If this episode got you thinking differently about your food, please share it with a friend, leave a rating, and write a review. It helps more people discover One Bite is Everything and join the conversation. This episode was co-produced by Sonia Dillon and sound editing and original music provided by Russell Chapa. Thanks for listening to One Bite is Everything, connecting the food on your plate to the rest of the world. I'm your host, Dana DiPrima. See you next week.